In The Transcendence of the Ego, Jean-Paul Sartre offers a groundbreaking critique of the traditional understanding of the self and consciousness, advancing his existentialist theory. He argues that consciousness is fundamentally impersonal and does not require a central ego for it to function. Sartre claims that the ego is not an intrinsic part of consciousness, but rather something that arises from our reflective thinking. When we look back at our experiences, we construct the idea of the self. This perspective challenges the conventional Cartesian view that equates consciousness with the self. Sartre's central thesis is that consciousness is always directed outward, toward objects and experiences in the world, rather than toward an internal self. This outward-directed nature of consciousness is what he calls intentionality, meaning consciousness is always consciousness of something. In this sense, the ego exists only as an object within consciousness, but not as its foundation. This separation allows for the possibility of freedom, as individuals are not bound by a fixed internal self, but can redefine themselves based on their actions and decisions. By rejecting the necessity of a pre-existing ego, Sartre posits that human beings are radically free to shape their identities and destinies. He argues that we often fall into the bad faith of believing in a permanent self as a way to escape the anxiety that accompanies our freedom and responsibility. Instead of hiding behind a constructed ego, Sartre advocates for an authentic engagement with our freedom, where we recognize that the self is a product of our actions rather than a preordained essence. Moreover, Sartre highlights the importance of understanding that the ego exists within the field of consciousness as a tool for navigating the world, but it should not be mistaken for the core of our being. He claims that focusing on the ego can lead to self-deception and alienation from the world and others, as it locks us into a rigid identity. True freedom comes from transcending the ego and engaging with the external world directly and authentically. Sartre's existentialism in The Transcendence of the Ego ultimately challenges the reader to recognize the illusion of a fixed self and to embrace the fluidity of existence. The ego is a byproduct of self-reflection, not the driver of consciousness, and we are free to transcend it in our pursuit of authentic living. This liberation from the ego opens up new possibilities for personal growth, ethical responsibility, and self-definition through action. Life lessons from the transcendence of the ego. You are not defined by a fixed self. Sartre's philosophy encourages us to abandon the belief in a permanent, unchanging I. Instead, we are constantly shaping and reshaping our identity through our actions and choices. Freedom lies in embracing responsibility. True freedom comes with the acknowledgement that we are responsible for who we become. Avoiding the illusion of a static self allows us to accept full accountability for our decisions and to shape our future authentically. Consciousness is outward-focused. Instead of being obsessed with self-reflection or inward contemplation, Sartre teaches us that true consciousness is about engaging with the world, experiences, and other people. Living authentically requires us to focus outward. Avoid the trap of bad faith. Bad faith is the attempt to escape freedom by believing in a rigid, predetermined self. Sartre encourages us to confront our fears of freedom and embrace the potential for change, growth, and personal transformation. Authenticity comes from action, not reflection. Rather than dwelling on an inner ego or self, Sartre suggests that authenticity is found in what we do. Our actions define us, and by actively engaging in the world, we transcend the limitations of the ego and live more fully,